Hello, I'm Mark McSweeney, Executive Director of the Association Societies Alliance. Collectively, through our Society of Association Executive Members, we represent over 4,000 trade, professional, and individual membership associations in 40 states, as well as New Zealand and Australia. We are proud to partner with our member SAEs and, of course, Jeff Tenenbaum, Sarah Hens, and Rebecca Humphrey to provide this newest entry into our series of timely COVID-related topics, post-COVID return to the workplace, HR, and office considerations for associations. Today's webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be made available after the program concludes. Please note that there is no slide deck for today's program. However, during the program, we will have an opportunity for Q&A. To ask a question, please enter that into the question box on your screen, and we'll be sure to ask the panel to address those on your behalf. And with that, I am pleased to introduce our facilitator for today's webinar, Jeff Tenenbaum. Jeff is one of the nation's leading nonprofit attorneys and also is an accomplished author, lecturer, and commentator on nonprofit legal matters. As managing partner of the nationally recognized Washington, D.C.-based Tenenbaum Law Group, Jeff counsels his clients on the broad array of legal issues affecting trade and professional associations, charities, and other nonprofits. For 19 years, Jeff practiced law at the Venable Law Firm and chaired its nonprofit practice for most of that time. Among numerous other honors and awards, Jeff was the 2006 recipient of the American Bar Association's Outstanding Nonprofit Lawyer of the Year Award and is one of only 5 lawyers in the prestigious U.S. Legal 500's Not-for-Profit Hall of Fame. Jeff is the author of the ASA e-published book, Association Tax Compliance Guide, and currently serves as chair of the American Bar Association's Trade and Professional Associations Subcommittee and on the ASAE Legal Advisory Council and Public Policy Committee. With that, I'm happy to turn it over to you, Jeff.
Thank you, Mark. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning to those of you on the West Coast. We have a great crowd gathered for today's webinar, which I am pleased to be able to moderate. And as Mark said, please do post your questions in the Q&A box, but please post them throughout. This is going to be a very interactive program, as between Sarah, Rebecca, and myself, and you guys. So it's going to be a lot of free-flowing Q&A from me to them, and me also offering some kind of color commentary when it comes to legal aspects of these issues. But we want to get as many questions from you guys as we can. I suspect that a lot of the questions that you guys are going to ask, we will have addressed or will address anyway, but please do ask your questions as we go along, and both Mark and I will be kind of monitoring the Q&A box and offer them, pose them to our speakers. With that, I'm going to give a brief introduction of Sarah and Rebecca, and then we'll get underway. Sarah Hensey is an HR consultant with TPO, a management and human resources consulting firm. She has over 20 years of experience in business operations, most of her experience focused on human resources. Her core expertise is in compliance, compensation and benefits planning, policy and procedure development, and training and staff development. She has extensive experience in senior leadership roles in a wide variety of small and large organizations, including government contracting, technology firms, and most importantly, from our perspective, nonprofits and associations. She's comfortable managing direct reports in large structured organizations and collaborating with teams in matrix organizations. Rebecca Humphrey is Executive Vice President at Seville's and Workplace Practice Group Leader for Seville's North America. The Workplace Practice Group specializes in a variety of service lines, including workplace analysis and strategy, wellness and sustainability programming, change and communications management, design and space planning, and space utilization and optimization. Rebecca oversees all aspects of the group across the US and Canada as it helps clients address the ever-changing workplace, developing and deploying workplace strategies and processes that align with clients' business goals. I have had the privilege of speaking before with Sarah and Rebecca, and of working with both of them in connection with various client matters. They're both true pros. They really know their stuff, and you have a lot you're going to be able to learn from both of them here today. While both of them and me do obviously extensive work in connection with workplace issues, the focus of today's program, and frankly the focus of most of my time, Sarah's time, and Rebecca's time these days, is COVID related. And the focus of today's program is kind of the post-pandemic, hopefully soon post-pandemic, and a return to the workplace. I know from the 400 or so clients that we work with, which are all across the country, and I know Sarah and Rebecca have similar experiences, associations right now seem to be a bit all over the place in terms of their return to the workplace. We work with some clients who are fully back in the workplace right now. It tends to be in certain states, in certain parts of the country, whereas, for instance, in DC, where I'm located, some of our clients, the CEO and some senior staff are back in the office on a somewhat regular basis. Some, I just had lunch with the CEO of a client yesterday where they have people back 1 day a week in the office. The rest are working remotely, but everyone is just all over the place, and things are very much in flux, in part because kind of the state of the pandemic and the COVID-19 virus are still very much in flux. So this is kind of a moving target, but regardless, wherever your association is in the return to work cycle, and some associations, as you know, and maybe some of yours included, have also decided if they have the ability, to let an office lease expire or get out of the lease, to go completely virtual. And so we're going to try to speak to all of these issues, but obviously with a focus on a physical return to the workplace in whole or in part. These are complicated, difficult, nuanced issues. Of course, a lot of this is informed by the law and legal considerations, but frankly, to me, so much of it is more importantly informed by a lot of non-legal considerations. There is no one size fits all. There's no silver bullet answers to these things. And kind of the applicable laws, rules, best practices seem to be changing on an almost weekly basis, which makes all of this more challenging. So with all of that as background, let me get started by posing some questions to Sarah and Rebecca today. So Sarah, let's say my association is deciding, we're going to return to the office, after Labor Day, or I'm hearing a lot of folks talk about, November target date for at least a partial return to the office. I know everything's all over the place, but once we do, and whether it's a full-time, 5-day-a-week return to the office, whether it's, I'm hearing a lot of kind of 3 and 2, 3 days in, 2 days out. I know you're advising clients every day on these things. Whatever we decide, whatever the required in the office standards are going to be, can we require that our employees return to the office in that way?
Yeah, I mean, you can. It is completely reasonable to require that return. We've worked in the office before, and if it's appropriate for your job, it's something that you can do. The question is, should you, and under what circumstances? I think one thing to be mindful of as we walk through all of this, and I think you would agree with me, Jeff, as always, talking about return to work, vaccines, or the rest of it, we always have to recognize exceptions for medical conditions and religious exemptions and all of these things. But it's appropriate to bring people back if that's part of your mission. But is it right for your team? That's the big piece. Is it what you need to do?
Yeah, so we'll get into the the vaccination and mask wearing mandates and whatnot in a few moments. But if you could just elaborate a little more on that, is it right? And this is where you do a lot more work than I do as an outside counsel. What are you finding in terms of what is right for many organizations? To the extent you can kind of extract best practices or practices that you think are working very well in terms of what works for. Can you just maybe give us some examples of different types of organizations and where a certain structure would work well for some and not for others?
Yeah, I think size matters. The size and the density in your space makes a difference in what people are comfortable with. What I'm finding is there's also a question of comfort, and one thing that has been successful with some of the groups that I'm working with is polling their employees, surveying and asking who would like to come back. In some cases, people are desperate to get back to the office to have some structure, or if they're in tight quarters with family members, to get a little separation there. Also taking a look at what jobs can continue to be offsite. There may be some benefits to that. So I think it's a question of having those conversations. Ways that you can do that, obviously if you're 5-10 people, that's an easy group conversation to have. If you're larger, one of the groups I work with is closer to about 60. We broke it down into some small work groups, 3-4 people at a time, and kind of discuss some key questions. And we're working on a pilot group right now to help us refine the return to work process and to work with just a core group of about 5 people to reopen that office, and kind of make sure that we're communicating clearly, make sure that the plans that we develop are clear, and to make sure that we're covering all the bases. And it alleviates for, again, that small group of people that are just crawling the walls to get back to an office. It kind of gives them a chance to jump in a little before the rest of the group. So pretty hopeful that that will be a good approach for this particular organization.
That's great. Rebecca, kind of following on that, you're kind of in the real estate consulting business, essentially, in terms of offices and whatnot, and workplaces. So, what sort of kind of new arrangements, structures are you seeing some of your clients create, both to incentivize employees to return to the office, to make sure they feel safe and are safe? What sort of protocols are you seeing? Some of this may still be in the works and hasn't been implemented yet, but what are some of those things that you're seeing that you kind of view as best practices and things that folks should consider?
I think you hit on it in the beginning, Jeff. I think one thing we can say pretty clearly is I think a lot of us thought, as we were kind of navigating these waters and helping clients get back to the office, we were going to see these large holistic trends that everyone was doing. And I would say the only trend we're seeing is everyone is talking about this and everyone has some component of hybrid. I would say outside of that, it's very much singular to each organization and what works best for them, what works for their culture. Exactly like Sarah said, the size of their space, the density, what that person's job function is. I think to some of the specifics you were asking about, I think right now what we're seeing is, a lot of companies communicating things like cleaning protocols and things like that. I would say from an employee expectation perspective, that's now like the bare minimum. I think every employee is assuming their companies are having those cleaning procedures and social distancing and things like that where it's applicable. Where we're seeing a lot of challenge within the companies we are helping right now is in the kind of, I don't like the word policing, but policing those policies, right? How are you actually making or implementing and enforcing those? You can have a great policy, but if you don't have a good structure or good infrastructure to make sure that you are making sure people adhere to those, it doesn't really matter what your policy is. So a lot of the conversation we're seeing right now is around that, really, the policies that you're putting into place, and then how do you make sure people are actually adhering to them? It ties into lots of the things we've spoken about before as a group, things like, are you requiring vaccinations? Are you requiring proof of vaccination? Are you having physical distancing and things like that? Is there some type of attestation you're asking people to sign? So those are all the different types of things we're seeing people talk about. I think as far as like incentivizing people, that's kind of all over the map. Certainly, like you read in the news, some bigger companies that are like doing crazy things to incentivize people back to the office. But that's, I would say, not like the default or the majority of what we're seeing. For most organizations, they're really trying to incentivize people, I think, culturally and, to have people excited to be back where they can collaborate. And they're also, I think, majority of people we're working with are trying to maintain some level of flexibility and giving people a feeling that they have some control over, whether they're back or not, or some of, feeling safe within their workplace.
So Sarah, kind of building on that, and we are going to talk about vaccine mandates and proof and all of that stuff. But before we get to that, like you just said, Rebecca, there's not a lot of common trends and themes we're seeing yet. But one of the things that we are seeing is that, virtually every association that I've talked to, at least for now, is looking at some sort of hybrid arrangement, part in the office, part out. And the organization whose CEO I had lunch with yesterday was telling me they have all their employees have to be in 1 day a week, and they do it by department, so that the department is all coming in on the same day, so that they have the collaboration and a chance to connect in person. And then they also are developing kind of a longer term remote work policy where people are going to have a choice, how many days they want to come into the office beyond that bare minimum. And if they are going to be in, I think, 3 days a week or more, then they will get a dedicated office. If not, then they'll have a shared office, but the association's going to use, they're going to go through good cleaning protocols to clean those shared desks and computers and workspaces and whatnot in between usage and whatnot. But Sarah, in terms of kind of remote work policies, and we have to maybe separate the short term from the long term, although
Right.
what I'm seeing, and I'm sure what you're seeing, I think the short term is going to affect the long term. I think remote work for most associations is it was here before for so many associations, but it's here at a much different level than it ever was before, and probably will stay at a much different level than it ever was before. Are you seeing any kind of common trends, themes, best practices in remote work policies generally?
Not as much as you would hope. And I think we were all so reactionary when all of this started that everybody just said, go home. But I know for all of us at TPO, we are advocating taking a good hard look at your remote policies, the telecommuting policies, and making sure that you're kind of reviving those and that they do match your current state. Also for people that were initially sent home, kind of, it's time to be safe and go home. Let's get back to them and make sure that they're taking a look at their home space. Are they set up properly to work from home? Do they have the right connectivity? Are they actually working at a desk or a proper workstation that's safe and comfortable for them? So, I think what I'm, my point is I'm preaching it's time to take a look and dust it off and make sure that as we go forward, because you said the word flux early on and we're going to stay in flux. Are we taking some lessons learned and carrying those forward? So I definitely preach reviving those policies and giving them a once over.
One of the things that I do hear more consistently, if we're talking about themes, from a lot of association CEOs, is that while the associations have been able to function pretty well remotely, most association jobs can be done remotely. Now it's a little different, for instance, when you get back to in-person meetings. If you're having in-person meetings, you need to have staff to staff the in-person meetings. And so a complete remote structure for certain types of positions is not going to work full time. But it might work, the rest of the time. But the one common theme I'm hearing from a lot of CEOs is we're missing the collaboration and the interpersonal element, and we're having a harder time onboarding new staff to get them integrated into the culture and make the personal connections and everything that comes from having lunch with people in the office, out of the office, the water cooler, coffee discussions, and meeting up for drinks after work, and all the stuff that tends to happen when people are in the office. That they're missing that and they're suffering from it. Some CEOs that I work with are really pushing very hard to get people back for that reason. Others are maybe just recognizing it's just going to be a fact of life that we're not going to be able to. That's just one of the, there's pros and cons of all different structures, and that's just maybe one of the cons that we're going to have to deal with. Are you seeing any kind of best practices, creative structures for how to deal with that collaboration issue when you're in a virtual world?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I've noticed, and I completely agree, onboarding people over the last year and a half has been rough, and particularly onboarding people who are new to their career or, new to whatever the profession is that they're sitting in. A lot has been lost. I think if there are opportunities for organizations to continue to open up their web channels so that people have time after work or off hours to chat and communicate with each other. I think if there are opportunities to bring people in for those small groups, do you have a conference room where 2 or 3 people can meet for lunch? Again, distancing, space, and those kinds of things, but are there ways to do that safely? The other thing that I've started doing with a couple of groups, particularly for new hires, is really looking at mentorship within the organization. Finding that person who's not a direct line manager, but somebody that can help fill in the blanks and kind of read people in on how the organization functions, all of the unspoken pieces. So that's been a way to kind of create some one-to-one contact outside of that managerial line to give people some more connection. But it is tough, and that is, bridging that gap, I think, is going to be the hardest thing. And it's also, I think convincing people that that's something that needs to be addressed. A lot of people have become very comfortable being remote, but there are definitely some missing pieces in the work community from it.
Yeah. Rebecca, in terms of clients that you're working with that are kind of figuring out what do we need to do to reconfigure our office space, our workplace, to accommodate what is likely going to be an ongoing threat from COVID for some time to come. What sort of things are you seeing, the design changes, layout, structuring? Give us some ideas of what you see some of your clients who are planning for that in-person return and are making changes as a result. What are some of those kind of changes that you're witnessing?
So I would say we're not seeing a lot of design changes or money spent on like redoing the workplace unless you have a lease expiring or there was like already a project in the works pre-COVID. In those instances, then yeah, we're seeing some redesigns, or like design was halted and they're rethinking it based on everything going on. But other than those instances, I would not say we're really seeing a lot of money spent on redesigning things holistically or like knocking walls down. Maybe some furniture reconfigurations, but that's, I would say, kind of the max for the most part that we're seeing. Similarly, I think a lot of people right now are trying to figure out what that long-term layout is. Most people kind of went with like the X and O strategy when this first started, and if you still had people coming in, or you just took some desks out of commission if they were out in like a workstation area. And now they're really trying to think, do they want to have a less densified workspace as an example? Some of the things we're seeing people think about in terms of their layout, I would say, it's less because they're trying to figure out things like social distancing in the future, and it's more them trying to reimagine how their workplace is going to help support a new way of working. And so if you have a hybrid workforce, like Sarah was saying, if you have a team and half of their team is remote one day and half is in the office, do you have the right support spaces to actually facilitate that type of work? Whether that's Zoom rooms, conference rooms that have the right tech setup and things like that. And so we're seeing some people think about de-densifying so they can free up space to accommodate those types of support spaces for this newer way of working. We are seeing some people go to things like hoteling or free address. In some instances, again, if you've shrunk your space or consolidated as a result of COVID, but you still have the same head count and you're trying to figure out how that same head count can be in the office, but you don't have as many seats, that's where you see some of the strategy on things like free address, hoteling, day officing, or really a stronger hybrid plan, like instead of one day in the office, or maybe it's like a 2-3 balance or something like that.
Thank you. All right, let's get into a topic that I spend at least part of every day counseling clients on, and I know, Sarah, you do as well. And that's kind of vaccine mandates, proof of vaccination, mask wearing and social distancing mandates, and kind of the whole bucket of related issues. Let me take kind of a moderator's privilege to give just a few minutes of kind of overview of the legal construct here so we're all on the same page. The EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is the principal federal regulatory agency when it comes to kind of equal employment laws in the workplace. There's also OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Both agencies have been very active during COVID in putting out guidance. OSHA more focused on kind of safe workplace space and working conditions, and the EEOC focused on things like enforcement of Title VII and the Civil Rights Act and anti-discrimination laws and things like that. The EEOC has put out some really helpful guidance, a whole series of very detailed Q&As on these topics, and kind of that's where we look to first to see how do they interpret. They don't write the laws, but they interpret the laws in this area. And what they have said very clearly is that if you are an employer, because COVID is a very risky transmissible virus that puts all workers potentially at risk, it is because we have vaccines that are safe and effective, even under the emergency use authorization, which will likely and presumably soon, be granted full authorization by the FDA. That it is even now legally appropriate to mandate vaccinations as a precondition of returning to the workplace, or traveling for work, or doing any business on behalf of your association, so long as you recognize that there are two exceptions that have to be made. And when I say exceptions, if you read about this stuff a lot, which I'm sure all of you have, you read about these exceptions, and it's not that someone is automatically exempted from the vaccination requirement. I'll explain that in a minute, but the two exemptions you have to, the two exceptions you have to focus on are: one, if someone has a sincerely held religious belief that prevents them from getting vaccinated, or two, if someone has a qualifying medical condition that would make it risky for them to be vaccinated. If one of those two things occurs, standard is a little bit different for each. One comes from the Americans with Disabilities Act, and for those of you that have smaller workforces where the ADA might not apply, there's a lot of state versions of the ADA that apply to smaller workforces. And then the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act is where the religious, the ban against religious discrimination comes into play with that religious exemption. If either of those two things occurs, then you have to make a reasonable accommodation for those individuals. So long as A, with that reasonable accommodation, they can still perform the essential functions of the job, and B, so long as that accommodation does not pose an undue burden on the association. I've been dealing with a lot of clients on both of these, clients that have decided or thinking about or already announced a vaccine mandate for return to work. And we've already had a number of requests for exemptions from employees. On the sincerely held religious belief, it's a tough one because there's no way to objectively verify whether someone has a sincerely held religious belief. What we do know is a religious belief is not a political belief. That is a sincerely held religious belief. And if there are good, reasonable, solid grounds for doubting someone's sincerity on the religious belief, which we had with one of our clients, you can push back on that. On the medical exemption, we've had a number of employees of associations and nonprofits kind of claim that medical exemption, but claiming it for medical reasons that don't seem to have any apparent connection to a vulnerability or a danger with taking the vaccines. And from what I've heard from a number of experts, there are actually very few medical conditions that would make it very risky to take one of the COVID vaccines. And you're allowed to, just like with all issues under the ADA and the employment provisions, you can ask for a doctor's note, essentially verification of the reasons why someone believes that they're not able to take the vaccine. So they're very narrow exemptions is what I'm trying to say. And two, if someone does have a credible basis for one of those exemptions, it doesn't mean you say, okay, you can just come into the office without a vaccine. You have to make a reasonable accommodation so long as they can still perform the essential functions of the job. The two most common reasonable accommodations we are seeing are: one, allowing them just to continue to remote work. And that might work for someone who actually does not have to be on site at a meeting, for instance, to staff a meeting, or does not have to be in the front office as a receptionist in your office, to greet people coming into the office, or is not delivering the mail, and things like that, where remote work would not be a reasonable accommodation because they could not still perform the essential functions of the job. The other reasonable accommodation that seems to be we're seeing developing as the norm, and I just saw in just yesterday, it was announced in Washington, D.C., where I'm based, that the mayor announced that all DC employees and contractors, starting on a certain date, I forget what the date is, are going to have to either obtain one of the vaccines if they want to continue to work for the city, or show proof of a negative COVID test on a weekly basis. And that latter is kind of the other reasonable accommodation that we're seeing starting to evolve as kind of a common theme, which is obviously burdensome on an employee. But that seems to be acceptable in most cases as a reasonable accommodation. What is a reasonable accommodation is a very fact-specific determination that's supposed to be an interactive discussion and an iterative process between the employee and the employer, and it's going to vary, based on a case-by-case basis, based on all of those facts. So, with all of that in mind, you can mandate vaccines. You can also ask for, and the EEOC has said this as well, you can also ask for proof of vaccination. And what they have said is that if you're going to ask for proof of vaccination, like for instance, showing a copy of your CDC vaccination card, that information should not be stored in the employee's personnel records. It should be stored separately and should be very much safeguarded. This is not because of HIPAA, the federal health privacy law in the US, because HIPAA doesn't apply to most associations because they're not healthcare providers or business associates of healthcare providers. But where this comes from is the Americans with Disabilities Act, which has a requirement to safeguard the confidential medical information of employees. So for our clients that are doing this, they're generally having the employees show proof of vaccination to, say, the head of HR or the COO or whoever the designated person is, and they keep a record of that, like say in a spreadsheet with, you know, the date of the last vaccination and the type of vaccine they received, and that stays strictly confidential. But you can do that. Other associations are going on a self-attestation model. You have the flexibility to do either. And if someone who doesn't fit into one of those two exceptions refuses to get vaccinated, I just had a call from a CEO of a client yesterday where one of their employees said, because they were talking about what their new vaccination policy is going to be, and that the employee said, I'm not vaccinated and I don't plan to be vaccinated. If they don't fall into one of those two categories, then, and if they refuse, they can be terminated. And the EEOC has said that as well. Now, I'm not at all advocating any particular position. I know Sarah and Rebecca, you're not either. I'm just explaining kind of the legal construct here, which is becoming clearer and clearer. Every association has to make these very difficult decisions about this. As you know, it's a highly political, highly polarizing issue. It's going to vary depending on what part of the country you are, the nature and culture of your association, the nature of your industry or profession represented by the association, and of course, how you implement it and how you roll it out. Everything else matters as well. The last thing that I'll say on this is that we're seeing some associations, and I'd say if there's a majority that I've seen so far of the clients of ours that have made a decision, they're not implementing a vaccine mandate per se. But what they're saying is, if you are not vaccinated and don't show us proof of vaccination, then you have to, when you're coming to the office or travel for work, you have to wear a mask at all times and socially distance. You know, right now in some places, like in DC and Philadelphia and other places, there's an indoor mask mandate, so it's kind of a moot point. But presumably at some point, like was in the past, those mask mandates will fall away. And so you can absolutely require that. And again, if someone refuses, then they can be terminated for insubordination. So that's kind of the basic lay of the land from a legal perspective. One other thing I should comment on is that you want to continue to stay on top of state laws. Right now, and Sarah, you correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not aware of any state laws that prohibit employers from having a vaccine mandate or a mask wearing mandate. But there are a number of states that have, there's many states that have passed laws that have said that government agencies in those states cannot cannot ask for proof of vaccination. You know, like Florida prohibit mask mandates. And then there are about, I forget if it's 5 or 8 states, I think it's 5 states that prohibit businesses from asking for proof of vaccination as kind of a precondition from entering the business. You know, think restaurants, stores, venues, things like that. They don't prohibit a vaccine mandate, but they prohibit asking for proof of vaccination. Texas and Florida are the 2 biggest ones in that regard. Alabama is the one state that actually prohibits businesses from even asking, like, for people to self-attest that they're vaccinated as a precondition of coming into their businesses. Those laws, though, at least from my interpretation, they seem pretty clear that they do not apply to employers. They also, while it's a little bit outside the scope of this program, we do a lot of work with association meetings and conferences, as most of you guys know. And while they don't seem to apply to, say, an association that's holding a conference, you know, say an association that's based in DC, but is holding a conference in Dallas and Texas, they don't seem to apply to the association per se, but they would presumably apply to the venue, the hotel, convention center, where the meeting and conference is being held. So effectively, it's going to apply to the conference in terms of being prohibited for asking for proof of vaccination. But these laws are changing on a very, very regular basis. I expect that we're going to see more of this stuff. Again, I've not seen or heard of one that applies in the employment setting, but I wouldn't be surprised if that happens at some point. So you want to keep an eye on that. So Sarah, with all that as background, give me your thoughts, reactions, things that you've seen, not repetitive of what I said, but from your perspective, what are some things that you think folks should be aware of?
Yeah, I think that you covered all of so many good points in there. I think the multi-state question is one that is important for people to consider because so many of our employees are living in different states right now. We're going through with all of our clients and kind of doing some headcount reviews to make sure we know where people are so that as we advise our clients, we know which states to go look up information. I think if you work with your HR consultants, your legal advisors, but all of us can learn where that information is for all of the different states. Again, DC has a wonderful DC Reopen that has business resources. Most of the states have something like that that gives you a place to go. I think at the other part of this, the putting the human in human resources is also your employees when you talked about those things like the sincerely held religious beliefs and medical accommodations. If you know of employees that have concerns, be prepared to have conversations with them. Some of the groups I work with, one of them actively volunteered with the Department of Health to get vaccines out. Everybody's vaccinated. It's a non-issue in this particular environment. But for other clients, we know that there are going to be some difficult conversations to have. So if you can take time to consult with your attorneys to make sure that your policies are compliant with your particular localities, and then prepare with your management teams and HR consultants to deliver any messaging or coordinate, if you do need to coordinate medical accommodations or that kind of thing, be prepared to walk through those steps. But it's going to continue to be complicated, and it's definitely a fraught space to walk through for some people still.
Okay. By the way, we have some questions from the audience here as a follow-up. First off, one thing I should have added when I was talking about the proof of vaccination issue is that while the EEOC has said it's okay to ask for proof of vaccination, you should not be asking for any other underlying medical information from your employee. For instance, if someone says, I'm not vaccinated because I have a qualifying condition under the Americans with Disabilities Act, you are allowed to drill down and ask some questions about that. Obviously, none of that information should ever be disclosed. But other than that, if you're not falling into that category with the exception, then you should not be asking for any other medical information. And the EEOC has said that as well. Now, there's also a question, I don't know if I'm in a position to answer this, and you may not, Sarah, either. But clarification on why COVID vaccines can be required, but not other vaccines, such as for MMR, measles, mumps, rubella. I'll take my best guess at it. The EEOC said very clearly in their kind of Q&As, FAQs on this stuff, that the reason why they have said that it's okay for an employer to mandate vaccines is because COVID poses such a serious health risk to the workplace. Whereas other vaccines likely, at least all the ones that we're familiar with in the past, likely don't fall into that category because we're not dealing with diseases that are highly transmissible and deadly and whatnot. That would be my best guess on that regard, but I'm not a healthcare lawyer, so I can't say that for sure.
Yeah, I won't speak as a healthcare lawyer either, but certainly for some healthcare organizations, they certainly do flu shots with more vigor than an association ever would, the TB testing and some other things. So this is not foreign turf for all businesses. It's a little unusual from the association or the nonprofit space, but it is something that is not completely uncommon in other industries.
Okay. Let's try to get to some of these questions. My apologies for not getting to these earlier, but I wanted to kind of make sure we kind of laid the groundwork that first. We have 1 of 20 employees who's refusing the vaccine. We've implemented a mandatory vaccination policy by October 1st. Can we hold tight in this line, or do we need to make an accommodation for this employee? There is no medical or religious exemption. just belief. And, you know, I was working with one client that was considering what they were calling making kind of a compassion exemption, that even though they had about 6 employees at about 130 that that did not want to get vaccinated, but were asking for relief, basically to be able to continue to work remotely and not comply with a mandatory vaccination policy because they had, you know, like small children at home that weren't able to get vaccinated and they were scared of passing the virus on to them, or they were caregivers for some elderly parents living at home that were, you know, at high risk, you know, due to some chronic medical conditions and things like that. And they were thinking about, and you know, we talked through developing some sort of a compassion, you know, exemption policy that would allow, you know, people in those situations, at least temporarily for like 6 months, to be able to continue to work full-time remote and not have to come back into the office 3 days a week. In the end, they determined it was such a slippery slope and so difficult that it was just going to be impossible to consistently and objectively enforce, which is very important from a legal perspective. Anything you do in your workplace, you need to be sure to do it consistently and objectively. Otherwise, you run the risk of employment discrimination claims and things like that for disparate treatment and whatnot. So they decided not to do that. You know, in terms of your specific question, if you have a mandatory vaccination policy by October 1st and they don't fall into one of the exceptions and they refuse to get vaccinated for, you know, reasons that don't fall in one of those 2 exceptions, you can say, you know, I'm sorry, and you're not going to be able to work here. I've had some clients that I've like offered some severance pay, you know, 3-4 weeks of severance pay to help, you know, ease the transition out of the organization if someone wanted to voluntarily leave. But that's kind of the legal reality in terms of what's the right decision for your association. You'll have to make that your own decision. This question says, I have an employee whose family history includes issues that occurred as a result of medical recommendation for drug use that was given to the parent when they were a child. As a result, she won't take the vaccine until there's been long-term testing. You know, it's the same answer, right? So someone that doesn't fall into those one of those 2 exceptions, if you decide you're going to make some exemption, say you have a mandatory 3-day week return to the office, and you know a vaccination policy. I mean, one answer would be, okay, you can come into the office. I mean, we're not going to terminate you. Say you don't have a mandatory vaccination policy, but you say, like I gave the example earlier, either you get vaccinated or you have to wear a mask and socially distance. You might offer them that option. You might have, you know, more flexible. Some clients are saying to all of their employees, if you want, as long as your position allows for it, we're going to allow you to continue to work full-time remote if you want to. So you know, there are some other options. I'm not suggesting that everything has to be that firm and rigid, but whatever you do, you need to do it on a consistent, objective basis. So, for instance, if you're going to offer, you know, full-time remote work for at least for the foreseeable, let's say 6 months, 12 months, for anyone who wants to, so long as their job allows for it, you need to do that on a consistent and objective basis. Okay. For an association, who should be making the decision about mandate a vaccine? The executive director, the board of directors, etc. Look, what I will tell you, for those of you who are CEOs and executive directors, most association boards are very interested in this topic. You know, it all depends on the relationship that you have, but I would not suggest that any decision this consequential be made without at least consulting with your executive committee or your board. I'm not suggesting that they should be the ones making the decision. And you know, as someone who does a lot of work in this area of kind of board governance and relationship with management and works on a lot of CEO employment contracts, I've always believed it's really important that management and the CEO ultimately has, you know, the final say-so in workplace policies. But I would definitely keep your board, or at least your executive committee, informed about what's going on. What about mandating like weekly COVID tests and requiring mask wearing in the office? Yeah, I mean, if you're going to say if you're not vaccinated, then if you want to still work for us and we have a requirement to come into the office, you have to show a negative COVID test and wear a mask and socially distance. You can absolutely do that. And I've had some employers ask me, well, then the people that are wearing masks, everyone's going to know, and say it's in the minority of the workforce, everyone's going to know that they're the unvaccinated ones. That's okay. Now, that doesn't allow for workplace bullying or other things like that, which can give rise to liability for the employer. But the EEOC said that's absolutely okay. I remember what I said. HIPAA, with the exception of association health plans, HIPAA does not apply in this setting, but the ADA's requirement to keep medical information about your employees confidential very much does. A lot of these are similar questions. And Mark, feel free to jump in. Oh, here's one I wanted to talk about. Sarah, I'm going to get back to you on this. So one of the things that we've seen with remote work, even over the last year and a half, is that we know that when an employee is working more than just on a short-term basis, permanently or indefinitely from a particular state, that employee is subject to the protection of the employment laws in those states. Right. And not just employment laws, but the association is also subject to tax laws, state and local tax laws and other things, unemployment insurance and workers' comp and things like that. It can be a big hassle and burden, to start to comply with all of the laws in those states. You have to revise your employee handbook accordingly. You generally are registering with the state tax office for, and for unemployment compensation and all that sort of stuff. And some states are more burdensome than others. I know we have a few clients who have said, you can remote work, indefinitely, but not from these 6 states. California is always on that list because it's a very employee-friendly state from a regulatory perspective, and a lot of them don't want to deal with that. Even things like in California, overtime is calculated on a daily basis. Not on a weekly basis. So if you work more than 8 hours in a particular day, you get hit by you have to pay time and a half for overtime, whereas on the federal level, it's over 40 hours in a week. What are you seeing in that front? Any thoughts, suggestions? Best practices.
So many suggestions. This is one where again we're going back to all of our clients and saying, where are your people? Because we know a lot of people drifted, and we're making sure that handbooks are up to date. We're making sure that people are aware of the registrations and working with their accounting or finance teams to get those things in place. I think it can be a real ugly surprise for some people when those tax issues come up. There also, you brought up the regulatory pieces. There are leave laws. There are workers' comp issues in all of those places. It can really become nasty. The paperwork and repercussions can add up quickly. So we are working with our clients to go back through and say, where are people really? And is this a place that you're comfortable having them continue to work? And in a couple of cases, we've had people have asked the question of, well, I'm not going to support an employee in New York State or something like that. Again, one of these higher regulatory spaces. And the statement has been, or the question has been, can we require them to come back to one of our locations? So we've been working through those issues. So it's something to be thoughtful of. Some states have posted information, and again, you'll check with your accountants on all of this, but have posted that they're being a little bit looser on some of the tax issues, but that's not going to last forever. And on the other extreme, there are some states that are vigorously enforcing some of the taxes for employee locations. So that's a huge issue to look at. And it's also a question long-term of what your footprint looks like, where your resources are. There's good and bad to having people in different locations. So it's something to consider, all the pros and cons.
And I would just add, from a legal perspective, if you want to say that you can work remotely from all states except those on this list, you can lawfully do that. Again, you always have to be mindful of if that ends up having, a disparate impact on a certain class of employees, who are all of a certain race or ethnicity or other protected characteristic, that could, potentially cause problems. But other than that, you can do that. A few quick questions I wanted to answer. What about people who have had COVID and now have the antibodies? Is that an underlying health condition? I'm not. First off, remember what I said earlier, that that kind of ADA-based exception to a mandatory vaccination requirement only applies in a situation where someone has a medical condition where there's some objective basis for believing it would be risky for them to get the virus. That doesn't apply if someone has antibodies. And if you're also asking if someone had COVID and has antibodies, does that exempt them from the vaccination requirement? And the answer is no. If you wanted to, you could write a policy that way. I've not seen any employer who has, because the leading assumptions right now are that the antibodies only have a limited duration, and then from having been infected with COVID, and then they go down over time. The same thing is likely going to be the case with the vaccines as well. But no, you don't have to make an exception for someone that had the antibodies. Someone asked about if we're going to require a negative COVID test, say every week, for employees that choose not to get vaccinated, do we have to pay as the employer for the COVID test? And the answer is no, you do not. Another question asked if when we required people to start working from home, we started paying them a phone and internet stipend. But now that we're opening up the office, we'd like to stop the stipend. Can we do that legally? And the short answer is yes. Again, so long with that one caveat about potential disparate impact. If you want to treat everyone consistently and the same. But if you're saying, look, now we're going back to where we were before, our office is reopened, we're going to stop the stipend, you can absolutely do that. Rebecca, Sarah, and I have been hogging the microphone, so to speak, and we only have about 8 minutes left. I don't see other questions that are really directed at you, but why don't you, having heard all of this discussion, give us some other thoughts, insights, suggestions, kind of from your perspective of some things that you'd offer up as some guidance and recommendations.
Sure. I would say a lot of these questions, you have a lot of legal ground on, I don't want to say legal flexibility, but there is room for what you want to do. I think what this boils down to for a lot of companies is, from a perception standpoint, or what is it that ultimately you want to do, right? What's the pain threshold you have? So could you let that person go if they're not willing to get vaccinated? You can legally. Is that what you want to do? That's a different question. And so that's really what we're seeing a lot of people grappling with is, great, now that I know where I can go, like, what's the best next move for us culturally as an organization? Or, am I willing to withstand the potential fallout for some type of policy that I may want to go forward on? If I had to offer, I would say, a piece of advice to associations and decision makers right now, it would be, one, to remember, I think right now the voice of kind of the person not wanting to get vaccinated, the person who doesn't want restrictions, happens to be a lot louder right now than the people who are scared. I have people in our own company who have come to me saying, I want to come back into the office, I want to be there, but are we really strictly enforcing these policies? I'm nervous. And I think that voice tends to not be as loud and gets drowned out by a lot of the other things. And so just to be mindful of the balance of both of those sides. And then the other thing I would say that we're seeing a lot of companies or a lot of associations and people that we're speaking with thinking about is just keeping in mind that we've been drilling in people's heads for 20 months now, like, distance, safety, like nonstop. That's all people have been hearing. And now, like a light switch, we're asking people just shed that fear and come back into the workplace. And that's not an easy thing to do. It's not a light switch. And so where you can afford in your timeline to give people some runway to get acclimated back to the ideas of coming back in, where you can give yourself some runway to make sure you're rolling things out in a way that works best for you, is timeline-wise what we're seeing works most effectively. We haven't seen anybody really shift what their plans are because of the Delta variant or anything going on. What we've really seen is people push their timetable out. So they're keeping to what they've made decisions on as far as their planning, but they're saying, well, now instead of us doing this in August or September, we're really now looking at November or December, or even after, after Christmas and New Year's. And so where you have that runway, I would say, and you have the ability to have it, your business doesn't necessarily, the association work that you're doing doesn't necessarily depend on that, to give yourself that runway if you can afford to do so.
Great, thank you. A few quick questions I want to answer. One, there was a couple questions really that relate to, if our employer, if our association mandates vaccinations right now, and the vaccines only have an emergency use authorization, and someone ends up, having some adverse reaction from the vaccine that causes some serious illness or worse, can our association be held liable? First off, there's a lot of litigation ongoing right now, particularly against some large employers, think big factories and meat processing plants and other things like that, on a lot of these employer liability issues. So far, generally, the employers have been prevailing in most of the litigation that's had some rulings on it. But there's a lot out there. There's a lot of class action suits, and we'll have to see. But there is this legal theory that because the vaccines are only under an emergency use authorization and not a full authorization from the FDA, that if an employer mandates vaccines and something bad happens to the employee, that the employer could be held liable. From what I understand and have read and talked to other folks about, that it seems to be not the prevailing opinion amongst employment lawyers in this area. And as you can tell from so many large employers and government agencies and employers who are mandating vaccines, clearly that's not the prevailing thought on that issue, but I certainly can't say for sure. And like I said at the beginning, we are not advocating any particular approach that an employer take. We're just trying to talk about the pros, cons, considerations, and legal risks of different approaches. Someone asked, can we have our employees sign a liability waiver that says if we can track COVID, in the office, that we agree not to hold the employer liable? The short answer is no. It's not something that you can do because most of the state workers' compensation laws and structures, which is where these sorts of claims would have to go through. If someone filed a claim that they contracted COVID in the office and it's your fault, employer, for being negligent, that would go through the workers' compensation process, and it's illegal to waive your rights under state workers' compensation laws. So short answer is no. While liability waivers, I think, are a great idea for things like meeting and conference attendees, which are completely lawful, and they're not always bulletproof, but I strongly recommend them in the employment setting. It just doesn't work. Sarah, there's a question about, are there resources for employers on how to resolve employee disputes regarding vaccination status? And even maybe beyond resources, and this is kind of the last question for you, any thoughts, suggestions, best practices for, look, this is creating a lot of tension and concern. And what Rebecca said, I'm seeing this too, a lot of ground up, a lot of employees are saying, we want to come back to the office, but we want to be sure that everyone's vaccinated or everyone's safe, and what are you doing to enforce those rules? Why don't you speak to, how are you resolving some of these disputes and tension?
Well, I fortunately, I haven't had too many disputes, but anytime you're in that space of conflict, I think you have to go in to actually hear the concerns of the person that's bringing it up. If people have, for whatever reason, really do have fear or concerns about the vaccines, that's genuine. That is the space they're in. And so if you can be respectful of that perspective and walk through it with them, but you do need to be firm to your policies. If it comes down to it and somebody is not going to be vaccinated and you do need to proceed with the termination because your organization made the decision that you would be vaccinated, do it with the most grace and compassion that you can. It is it's difficult to do those things, but it doesn't have to be an argument, and it doesn't have to be a discussion about somebody's political perspective or anything else. It's simply the path that you're on, and you have to move through it. This is, again, one where it takes a great deal of support from management to pull these things off, and it's important to make sure that your management team all know what your standards and approaches are. I would say this is a great opportunity to focus on your communication when you put these policies out, and make sure that they are worded in a way that's clear and simple so that it's not a question or inviting the fight, so to speak. you know, messaging counts for a lot right now. And that's an important thing to hold on to.
Sarah, that's a great point to end on. I couldn't agree more. And I think it was Rebecca earlier talking about, you know, the importance of kind of surveying your employees and your workforce to try to see what, you know, where their heads are at, what their thinking is, trying to make decision making in this area by taking everyone's opinions into account. You're not going to please everyone. That's going to be impossible. But knowing what your employees think and care about, and then whatever decisions you do make, whatever policies you write and implement, implementing them with compassion, you know, trying to make accommodations to the greatest extent possible for your staff. If it's just not really a good fit, maybe being very compassionate and giving them a nice exit package so that they can leave, but, you know, have a runway to find a new position. I think all of that is critically important, and that's great advice. So on that note, we are going to wind up our webinar. Thank you, Sarah and Rebecca, for a terrific job. I know we threw a lot of information at you guys in the audience in the last 60 minutes, but hope you found it helpful. And thanks, Mark and Association Societies Alliance, for the opportunity to speak to you guys today.
Jeff, Sarah, Rebecca, thank you guys very, very much. It was some great content. I think we got to the vast majority of the questions. If we missed a couple, we apologize, but a lot of good information that went out. As a reminder to everybody, the webinar today has been recorded, is being recorded. So following the program, you will receive a brief evaluation along with, we will provide a link to the recording as well. And if you've got anything else we can do, please reach out to your local SAE and let them know what you need. With that, thank you for joining us, and please enjoy the rest of your day. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.